people are there to protect and to further the interests of the African people, I think doesn't stand up. But, you know, at the same time, something is changing. I mean, I completely agree with Exlo's point that there's a huge amount of continuity here. But I do also think that, you know, the fact that the investors and the politicians are talking about a new scramble for Africa does suggest that there's a kind of change, at least in kind of quantity, if not in quality, of the kind of operations that are taking place in Africa. And it seems to me we have to have a look at what has changed. And the first thing, I guess, is that there has been a sharp increase in the discovery of natural resources in West Africa and North Africa particularly, but actually in all sorts of parts of the continent. Mali has recently had important oil and gas discoveries. Algeria, for example, neighbouring Algeria, provides about half of all the natural gas supplies to European countries, and that's a proportion that has been increasing quite rapidly. Niger is an important supplier of uranium and other minerals, and there is a perception amongst the Western governments and the big corporations that there's a huge amount of untapped resources in Africa. So I think that's a very, very important element in the change situation. I think the second change element is, and it's obvious from the quotes and the things other people have said, is that there is a sharply growing involvement of China in the whole continent in terms of investment and some level of political engagement. I mean, there's a huge amount of secrecy around the actual figures for inward investment, both from China and from the Western countries. But I mean, if you just go Google it, and you'll find that any of the kind of graphs or charts that describe recent levels of investment from Chinese investment in the continent, they all show like very, very sharp upward curves, literally year on year. Never mind, you know, between now and the sort of 1990s. And you know, just like in the high colonial days of the second half of the 19th century, which was what has been called the first scramble for Africa, one of the things that's driving this current sort of involvement in the continent has been and is the cutthroat competition that the great powers are under and are feeling. And it's clear from the Kerry quote, you know, the US feels threatened by the growth of China and the involvement of China and the kind of the horrible status quo, which did involve this, the involvement of the ex-colonial powers in the region, is sort of being challenged and being undermined by what China's doing, and that's one of the reasons for the militarisation of the situation. The third factor, I would argue, is political instability. Which again is, you know, both challenges the imperial powers and also provides them with opportunities. I mean, we have to kind of, you know, in terms of how we conceptualise this, we have to sink to the level of depravity at which these people operate. There's no question that the potential for a kind of growing civil war in Mali is both seen in the corridors of Western power, both as in some way a threat. I think they are worried by the spread of Tuareg militancy and the possibility that has a destabilising various countries which have a Tuareg minority. At the same time, they do see it as an opportunity. The government that they essentially support is under threat. This gives them the kind of the pretext to move in and to say, okay, we're going to come in, we're going to help you, we're going to support you, as a way of reinforcing their power. So I think instability is a factor here, and that instability is itself obviously caused partly by the terrible deprivations that have been created by the sort of neo-colonialism, but also by the terrible impact of globalisation over the last 20 or 30 years in Africa, which has, as everyone knows, has created astronomical inequality, the destruction of what basic sort of social guarantees there were in these countries, and a kind of massively accelerated, unplanned urbanisation as whole areas of of the agricultural, whole agricultural areas are decimated by shifts on the world market, and that has created a huge amount of volatility and instability across the continent, of course, in other parts of the world. I also think we have to say, and this is one of the kind of horrible paradoxes and ironies of the situation, the war on terror itself has created the diametric opposite of what it claims to be about. It's actually created massive instability and an increase in the bitterness and hatred that millions of people feel towards the Western powers, themselves. I mean, you can't explain partly just the detailed situation of the Tuareg uprising, or the Tuareg struggle, without seeing it as partly caused by the chaos that's come from the attack on Libya and the destruction of the state in Libya. And more generally, you can't explain the spread of Al-Qaeda into the African continent and other parts of the world without understanding the anger and the bitterness that people feel against the growing intervention. So there's a kind of horrible cycle of violence that has been generated by the war on terror, which, as I say, is the very opposite of what they claim they're doing, which is to make the world a safer place and to create order and so on and progress. So, I think that's a sort of development of some of the themes that other people have talked about in terms of Africa. I just want to end by saying that I think as well the significance of the situation in Mali, when you combine it with the intervention in Syria and the growing tensions that the Americans are focusing on in the Pacific region now, that really what we're talking about is a situation where the war on terror is becoming permanent and it's spreading. Despite the kind of terrible experiences of the war, the occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the governments have learnt nothing, except that they should continue the same policies, which is an incredible thing, a terrible thing. There are a few novelties. A concentration on the use of third-party armies, proxy forces, particularly obvious in Syria, but also taking place in Africa as well. The concentration on training loyal local armies as opposed to engaging your own troops, the use of drones. I mean, all of these things are, that's a kind of development which is partly a technological thing, partly it's due to the spread, the spread of the war on terror itself. But partly as well, I do want to emphasise this, I think those things are all, to some extent, the product of the massive unpopularity and the massive opposition that there has been to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think, that we have to take some comfort and pleasure from the fact that we have, I think the prospect of Britain or America launching the kind of, massive, full-on, full-scale, full-spectrum dominance type operation in any country is, I won't say it's impossible, but it's much less likely now. And I think that is a product of the fact that people have demonstrated and protested and campaigned all around the world. And so that should give us hope. But nevertheless, this is a very bloody and destructive new phase of the war. And we have to do everything to continue to campaign and to continue to protest. I think, if it carries on like this, we're talking about whole states in a huge arc that spreads, after all, from kind of Pakistan and Central Asia right now through to Western Africa. I mean, it's a huge swathe of the world that is under the cosh here from Washington and the European powers. And it's an incredibly destructive and incredibly bloody prospect if this continues. So we do have to carry on campaigning, and we do have to step up the whole struggle against these wars. Two practical things to end on. One is, just in general, please do get involved. Please do sign up. Please do help out the people who've organised this meeting, Alistair and Rabia and Nadia, and just take over, help them sort of spread the word, spread the movement. See it as your campaign and your coalition, and specifically, support and promote a particular initiative, which is a demonstration that we're organising alongside CND and War on One on the 27th of April, which is a demonstration against the drones, because one kind of symptom of the spread of the war on terror is that Britain is soon to become a launch pad for drones. There's an RAF base called RAF Waddington, which is, we're not sure exactly when it's going to start. It may in fact already have started because they're so secret about these things, but they're tooling it up to launch these terrible killing machines. And we're going to have a demonstration from Lincoln, which is 5 miles away from the base, to RAF Waddington on the 27th of April, which is a Saturday, and we want to get people from all across the country to come to that protest, to make it a very, very high profile, very, very serious protest, which is obviously against this kind of horrible, remote, imperialist killing system that is being, that is being developed technically and being used technically and deployed technically. But it's also that system is a kind of symbol of these new wars, a symbol of the new phase of the war on terror. So we want it to be a protest not just against the technology, but against the whole idea that a time of recession, a time of economic slump, a time of so-called austerity for us and retrenchment and cutbacks, we're being told that we have to continue paying for wars that we're all against anyway. So please get involved, please join the Stop War Coalition, but also put the 27th of April in your diaries. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to open the floor for some questions now. Yep, 1, 2 and 3. Yep, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. My name's Ed Maltby. I'm from Workers' Liberty. I'd like to apologise for turning up late. I've got 2 things that I'd like to say. One's a plug and one's a question. And the plug is that currently, and this is why I'm so bedraggled and turning up late, the elections for the University of London Union SAB positions are on, and there's a left-right fight going on. And basically it's between Michael Chesham and Daniel Cooper, who are 2 socialists who are re-standing for the position on the one hand, and Will Hall, who is a Tory councillor for Henley-upon-Thames on the other. And one of the reasons why that's relevant to this particular meeting is that Will Hall, part of the platform that he's standing on, is as a right-wing backlash against Daniel Cooper and Michael Chesham for refusing to endorse the official remembrance ceremonies for the First World War, which took place last year. Cooper and Chesham said that these ceremonies marked an endorsement of Britain's colonial past, of the role of the monarchy and the military in British life, and that they didn't want to endorse these ceremonies. And Will Hall is standing on a platform of this is outrageous, you should respect this ceremony, respect the military, respect the crown. So it's a left-right fight in this election. I just wanted to make people aware of it. So please do vote in the UNU elections and get your mates to vote. Voting opens at 12 o'clock tomorrow, and if the organisers are all right, I could leave a couple of leaflets on the table at the end. And the question is about about anti-imperialist forces. I'd like to apologise for missing the first speaker's contribution. I've been running around campaigning. But sort of from some of what was said about Libya and China in later contributions, I think that it's important that people don't regard China as an anti-imperialist force in Africa simply because it's in conflict with the USA. And likewise, the Assad and Gaddafi regimes I don't think should be regarded as authentically anti-imperialist forces, especially given Gaddafi's history of, for example, invading Chad. And I think that what I view as the authentically anti-imperialist forces in Africa is the struggles of the African working class and oppressed. And there's 2 things in West African labour movement stuff that I just wanted to ask about, because I've not followed them, but I view them both as extremely exciting developments, and I apologise if I've missed this. But have there been any other echoes in West Africa, in French-speaking West Africa, from the Occupy Lagos movement over fuel prices that took place a bit ago? And also, is there any, in French West Africa and West Africa generally, is there any echo of the enormous labour war that's going on in South Africa at the moment? So those are the 2 things that I think are very exciting, is not only class struggle, but also anti-imperialist developments in Africa. I'd like to hear a bit more about them both.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'll just see if I'm thinking about it, so I'll come later for someone else.
I was, go ahead.
No, you can do this.
I was just wondering if people see the introduction of modern communication and technology to the introduction of like iPods, things like that, as being one of the key factors that why America and China are so interested in the mineral resources that are in Africa. Because until these big companies came along and the demand for handheld phones that we've all got became worldwide, they didn't seem to be interested. But now there is a demand for these devices. It seems like they're more interested in going into places where they can mine them cheaply.
Thank you very much. And the last question.
I'm actually from France, and there's a person over there called Jeremy, and I think I saw you post something about it as well. I've only just been introduced to his sort of studies, but he's looking at links between the US and the Algerian DRS, and also even the UK and the DRS, and I just wanted to know what you think of that sort of strategic relationship in a bit more detail, really, especially as it relates to the Algerian switch crisis.
Address question one.
Well, we're going to take all the questions together.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay. Any other questions?
No, I mean, sorry, I just meant you should maybe all sort of answer all three of them.
Oh,
Sorry.
Yes, I don't think that the issue of invading Libya is one of whether Gaddafi is anti-imperialist or not anti-imperialist. I think that if there are democratic struggles in Libya, the Libyan people have the right to self-determination and they have to decide what to happen to Gaddafi. I don't think that France or Britain or anybody has the right to go into other countries. What about if people say that they are not satisfied with the condition of black minorities in this country, and so African countries decide to also invade here and bomb places around Brixton and about the racism that goes on in this country. The other thing about the anti-imperialist forces that you were asking, see, everywhere where there is capitalism, there is class struggle. So the people in Africa are not any very different from people in other parts of the world. If you have been following the news, you will hear that even in Bamako, the French went kidnapping anti-imperialist activists. Basically, they kidnapped Omar Mariko, for example, that there had to be a lot of noise before Omar Mariko was released. And in fact, that is what should even draw our attention to the importance of international solidarity, because the Western countries are linking up with reactionary regimes all over the place, or they are creating puppet regimes all over the place. So people who are talking about anti-imperialism here too should be able to identify anti-imperialist forces on the ground who are also attacked by these very forces. The kidnapping of Omar Mariko, for example, is an issue. I didn't see anybody here making any noise about Omar Mariko being kidnapped in Bamako, for example, around this country. So it's good that you are asking, and I think that Workers' Liberty can take note of that, and so that they will be able to identify what to do with grassroots anti-imperialist forces, which are all throughout Africa. There's no country which does not have such forces. It will be very strange that the people in Africa will just be lying back, taking it, and that they would not fight back. The next question, what was that question?
Mobile phones and
Okay. I'll come to the other one. The other one about the DRS, the intelligence services of Algeria and the Western coalition, actually, because it was the cancelling of the election result of 1991 which started that process of infiltrating the Islamic Front. In fact, the same Western forces that have been campaigning during the late 80s, 89, 90 for democratization of Africa, calling for African countries to have elections, endorsed the cancelling of the election results. So even if they were not directly working with Algerian intelligence, they provided a useful climate for that work of the Algerian intelligence. And the end result has also been one which worked to their designs, because some of those forces did get involved in the Libyan Islamic fighting group. And so even if they were not planning directly, there's a way in which indirectly both the West and the Algerian intelligence services were having the same aims and were looking for the same results. And that has also contributed to the kind of forces which were in the northern Mali, the same way in which the French, together with the government of Mali, closed an eye on the presence of those forces in northern Mali, using them as a counterbalance against the Tuareg nationalists.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that's a good description of the situation, and there clearly are lots of cases where the West has either turned a blind eye to the development of so-called jihadi forces, or in cases backed them deliberately. I mean, and obviously in the case of Afghanistan, the whole creation of the Mujahideen was partly promoted and financed by the West during the Russian occupation, for example. And this is a process that continues. In Syria, some of the forces that have actually been fighting against Assad are, jihadi type organisations that indirectly or otherwise will have received funding and backing from either the West itself or from Western forces, Western proxy forces, Qatar and Western allies, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. This is something that happens. It shows the hypocrisy and the sort of the brutality of the Western powers. However, I don't fully buy into the kind of Jeremy Keenan analysis, at least on its own, because that's one half, or perhaps not even one half of the story. The other part of the story, and actually that particular interpretation can it can move into a kind of realm where Islamists are seen as the main problem in various different scenarios. That's the slight danger with it. I'm not saying that that's a deliberate thing, but I think that can happen. And really, it does, what it doesn't explain is the way in which these organisations do undoubtedly, in lots of different circumstances, get real support. And the fundamental reason for that is a much simpler one. It is the brute reality of Western intervention over decades in Africa, in the Middle East, which has been accelerated during the War on Terror, which means that anyone who takes up arms or seriously looks as if in any way they're prepared to challenge Western domination of these regions will actually gain some credibility. I mean, that's the truth. And if that has to be the main argument, really, I think, because I think the kind of although it's useful to point out the West's hypocrisy, and it's useful to say that actually they've in certain circumstances planted the seeds of a kind of blowback and so forth, really there will be resistance, there will be opposition, as long as the West bombs innocent people, massacres, does the night raids, backs the dictatorships and so forth in this region and others. Just the other point on anti-imperialism. I mean, I don't think we can put conditions on which foreign interventions we oppose and which we don't. We don't just oppose foreign interventions when there happens to be a kind of movement or a government in a particular country that we think is exactly the kind of government we would want to be there. Now, I mean, there's no question that Gaddafi wasn't, that Gaddafi was a kind of consistent anti-imperialist. In fact, Gaddafi had done a deal with, Tony Blair. Famously, he met in a tent and kissed Tony Blair, and basically Gaddafi was in the Western camp. But for a whole variety of reasons, partly I believe because the Western powers wanted to co-opt the widening democracy movement in the Middle East. The West, led by France and Britain, decided that they wanted to remove Gaddafi and sort of get to the head of you know, these kind of popular, I say with in inverted commas, movements, and I think they then went for it. As far as I'm concerned, I'm against Western intervention. I'm against bombing civilians. I'm against military occupation in any country, no matter what the government is. I remember exactly the same arguments being put forward about our opposition to the invading Iraq. People said, well, Saddam's a dictator. You know, the danger of this kind of conditionality leads to a situation where you can sometimes you can go soft on intervention. The point is, there is no democracy that comes out of Western bombing campaigns. There is only misery, there is only carnage, there is only mayhem. What other countries want to do or can do, or what the people of other countries manage to achieve in their own countries is frankly their business. I might have opinions on it, but the bottom line is I know that Western intervention is no way forward and will only cause absolute death and destruction. So I think we have to oppose it in all circumstances.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of points. I really strongly agree with what's just been said by the two speakers. I mean, I think the point on China in Africa is it gives African countries a choice. And that choice is what the United States do not want. They don't want African countries to have any choice in terms of you have to deal with the World Bank, you have to deal with the IMF, you have to have this neoliberal policy, this privatisation. And what did that bring? No growth, poverty, inequality, blah, 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 blah. Having a choice, having an alternative pole, allows African countries to negotiate the terms of what they want, try and get a better deal and stuff, and United States and Europe has responded to that through bombs, drones, and these interventions that we're seeing in Mali. So that's the point. It doesn't make any. You don't have to have an analysis which says China is anti-imperialist. It doesn't make a difference. What the point is that it's up to people of Africa to decide who they trade with and how they try and grow their economies and how they pursue a strategy to get people out of poverty. That is what matters. And if they can work with China, if they want to work with China, they can work with China. If they want to work with Latin America, they can do that. If they want to work with the West, they can do that. Wouldn't advise it. It hasn't really delivered very much progress up until now. And do you know what? They're not going to give you a very good deal either. But it's up for the people and those governments to decide their own future. And the West is against that. So it doesn't really matter. You can call it anti-imperialist, you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't matter. The point is, people can have different analysis about it. The point is, it's about people having a choice and freedom. And I think that's a progressive development, that people in Africa have a choice. During the 1980s and 1990s, there was no choice. It was neoliberalism was what was forced upon that continent, and with devastating effects. I think the point on Syria and Libya, again, it doesn't matter if someone, if a government is anti-imperialist or not. The point is, we are against Britain dropping bombs on Libya and Syria. We are against Western intervention because, again, it's up to the people of Libya and Syria to decide their own future. We don't want nothing progressive came out of the hundreds of thousands of bombs that rained down on Libya. Nothing progressive came out of 30,000 people's lives being ended by NATO when we waged war on Libya 2 years ago. That was not a step forward. And it doesn't matter. The point is, if you're against imperialism, you've got to oppose those military interventions and those wars. It doesn't matter what you see as the character of the government of the time in either Syria or Libya. But what I would say is, why do the West want to go after certain countries? Because they're not enough in the West pocket. I think, for example, with Syria, I think there's an inconsistency in the regime. However, the fact that Syria supports Hezbollah's resistance against Israel in Lebanon, the fact that Syria supported the resistance in Iraq to the United States invasion, means that it's totally intolerable to have Assad there, and that's why the West wants to get rid of him. But the point is, we're just against the West trying to get rid of regimes and installing their own dictators, for their own interest, to steal more resources, to oppress more people, because nothing good will come of it. So I think it isn't the question isn't to ask what how anti-imperialist is Syria, how anti-imperialist is Libya. The question to ask is how are we going to build a movement to stop imperialism invading that country, because all that will come of it is an even worse regime. That's what history has told us. You know, is the situation in Iraq more positive for the people now than it was 11 years ago? Absolutely not. Does that mean I support Saddam Hussein? Absolutely not. With 1 million people that marched on the streets in this country against the war in Iraq,